Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Women of Science. No further ado, I will introduce uh, Dr. Kiyoko Gotanda, who has worked in the Galapagos Islands, and she spoke at Vanier's Women of Science celebrations in 2015, and while she was working on her PhD. Um, she has met David Attenborough and has given him a talk, which is very exciting. Um, what I pull away from Dr. Gotanda's work is that she has looked at how humans have influenced life on the Galapagos, which we or I have learned was pretty much untouched by humans. That's not true anymore, and I don't think has been true for a long time. When Darwin first went there, it was untouched by humans, relatively speaking, I believe, and now and considered recent islands for this world. Dr. Gotanda has documented some of the changes in the species because of human influences. She is now doing her postdoc fellowship at University of Sherbrooke. So, Dr. Gotanda, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you again here at Vanier College.
Thank you, Stephanie, so much for such a lovely introduction. I really appreciate that. So let me optimize everything and share my screen. Start the slideshow and hide floating meeting controls. There. All right. So can you see the full slide? Is that all right?
It looks great.
Okay. So thank you again, Stephanie, for the invitation. And it's a real honor and pleasure to be invited to come back to Vanier College's Women of Science, celebration of women in science. So thank you very much for that. I'm currently a postdoc at the Sherbrooke University. And I also just wanted to remind everybody that today is Remembrance Day to honor our veterans. So today I'm going to talk to you, as Stephanie mentioned, about adaptation in a changing world, human influences on evolution. And I consider myself an ecologist, an evolutionary biologist, as well as a behavioral ecologist. And in these fields, one of our sort of prevailing question is, why do we have the biodiversity that we have? Where does it come from? What maintains the biodiversity? Why are we losing biodiversity? What can we do to preserve it? And so what you're looking at here is basically a tree of life, or a phylogeny, just to show the amazing diversity that we have. Now, one of the things that I'm very interested in that underlies biodiversity is adaptation. And this is because adaptation can lead to divergence both within and among populations, and this can lead to the generation of biodiversity. And so a classic example of what we call an adaptive radiation, where you have this sort of divergence from a common ancestor, are the Darwins Finches on the Galapagos Islands. And so what you're looking at here are several species of Darwin's finches. And we know that each of these species has evolved from a common ancestor. And so over here on the left, you have your ground finches, for example, which have sort of these crushing beak shapes. On the bottom, you have your more insectivorous beaks. And then on the right, you have your more probing beaks. So each of these species is defined by the shape and size of their beak, as well as other characteristics such as their body size. Now, thinking about how adaptation can lead to divergence can be a little bit, of an abstract concept. So I'm going to walk you through how phenotypes or traits can change through time. So if we go out in nature, if we go to the Galapagos Islands and measure a particular phenotype or a particular trait, such as beak size, since we were talking about Darwin's finches, we're going to observe within the population a distribution. So the question is, why are we observing that particular distribution of beak sizes in this particular population? And so what we can do is we can fit what's called a fitness function over that distribution of phenotypes. Now, fitness is basically your ability to survive and reproduce. So if you're this particular beak size, that means you have the highest probability of being able to survive and reproduce. Whereas if you have a larger beak size or a smaller beak size, you have less fitness, so you are less likely to survive and reproduce. So when we've gone out and measured this particular population distribution of phenotypes, we say that this population is locally adapted, where you have your distribution and the most abundant beak size is the one that has the highest fitness. Now, what can happen is there can be a shift in the fitness function. So with the Darwins Finches, very famously, Peter and Rosemary Grant found that drought had a significant impact on Darwin's finches and their beak size. So let's say there's a drought, and now the fitness function has shifted. So in the drought, particular types of food items are no longer available. So now what's happened is that the phenotype that used to have the highest fitness, the phenotype that was the most likely to survive and reproduce, now has very low fitness. And this particular phenotype, the larger beak size, now has higher fitness. And so what this means is that there's now selection acting on that particular population. And after several generations, what will happen if there's selection acting on this population is there will be a shift in the distribution of phenotypes. And now this particular population is again locally adapted, but the most abundant type of phenotype, the most abundant beak size, is now different from what it was previously, prior to the shift in the fitness function. So you can see how when there's selection acting on a population, it can lead to a shift in their particular trait. And ultimately what this can lead to is divergence in, this can lead to divergence, which can lead to speciation, which leads to biodiversity. Now, these adaptations are very, we see them in nature, and we as humans, though, adapt as well. And in my particular case, I actually have adapted quite a bit to science because I came from a very, very different background. And so my background, I was previously a ballet dancer. So I actually moved to Montreal many, many years ago, we won't say how many, to dance with Les Grands Canadiens de Montréal. And so I've got photos here. These are photos from when I was finishing my training in New York. This is from when I was in high school. And this is from when I was with Les Grands Canadiens doing ballet by Yuri Killian. And I made it onto the front cover of the entertainment section of the Gazette back when there were multiple sections of the Gazette, which unfortunately are no longer there. And so I have a very different background in that I came from an artistic performing art, and then ultimately found myself here as a science. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go on. Anyways, so going back to adaptation and divergence, what we know now is that humans have a really strong impact on this, for better or for worse. And so in collaboration with Andrew Hendry and Eric Svensson, we put together a special issue of Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society B. So what this journal does is you submit to them, we have an idea for a special issue, and here's the theme. And our theme was entitled Human Influences on Evolution and the Ecological and Societal Consequences. And what you're looking at are a list of the different types of human influences that we recruited articles, both review and experimental articles on. And this is a slightly distressingly long list. And what's even more distressing is that this is not an exhaustive list of all the different types of ways that humans are influencing evolution and having ecological and societal consequences. And so today I'm going to be focusing on two human influences: invasions, namely invasive predators, and urbanization. And to do this, I'm going to, as Stephanie mentioned, take you to the Galapagos Islands. So the Galapagos Islands are an island archipelago located about 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador or South America. And they're famous for a number of reasons, but one of my particular favorite reasons why they're famous is from this clip from Planet Earth 2 from their Islands episode. And this is an award-winning clip. So this particular clip, as I mentioned, is award-winning. It won a BAFTA, which is the UK equivalent of an Emmy, basically. So the Galapagos Islands are famous for that video clip, among many, many other fantastic video clips narrated by David Attenborough. Another thing that they're famous for is for being one of the places that a young Charles Darwin visited and eventually inspired him to develop the theory of evolution. And so Charles Darwin traveled around the world on the HMS Beagle for several years and visited a large number of places, and they spent quite a bit of time on the Galapagos. And Charles Darwin documented his travels in a book called The Voyage, appropriately, The Voyage of the Beagle. And what you're looking at on the left is a photo of a first edition copy of the book. And so Charles Darwin spent some time at the University of Cambridge, which is where I did my previous postdoc. And they have a fantastic library in the Department of Zoology. And I went to the librarian and she told me that they had this first edition of The Voyage of the HMS Beagle. And so I convinced her to let me look at the first edition and I could see all the plates and everything. So that was very exciting. So what Charles Darwin did in The Voyage of the Beagle is he documented what he did as a naturalist. And so some of the things that he did on the Galapagos as a naturalist, of course, was he would do things like ride giant tortoises, or he would also pick up marine iguanas and he'd pick them up and sort of marvel at the fact that he could even get close enough to pick them up and then throw them in the water, and then they'd swim back to him, and then he'd pick them up and he'd throw them in the water again, and just sort of marveled at what he was able to do with these organisms on the Galapagos Islands. And as I mentioned at the start, the Darwins Finches were what are now known as the Darwins Finches were also on the Galapagos Islands. Now these finches, when Charles Darwin got to the Galapagos Islands, Charles Darwin wasn't particularly interested in them. He thought they were kind of sort of drab colored. You can see the females are brown colored. He thought they didn't have a very interesting song. He was more interested in the mockingbirds, for example. But being a good naturalist, he sampled the finches and taxidermied them and put them in a bag and eventually went back to England. And when he got back to England and he was looking at his natural history notes and at his specimens, he was looking at the variety and differences in the different Darwin's finches. Now, unfortunately for him, when he did this, he did not properly label his specimens. And so he didn't know which finches were coming from which islands. But he knew that the distribution of the different species of what are now known as Darwin's finches differed among the islands. Fortunately for him, his colleagues that were with him on that expedition did properly label their specimens, and he also had museum specimens that were properly labeled to work with. And so eventually these finches now, which are now known as the Darwin's Finches, ironically, were originally of no interest to Darwin when he originally went there. So this is just a lesson if you pursue a career in science to properly label your specimens when you sample them. And so this is going to lead sort of abruptly, I don't have a very good transition, to one of my hobbies, and that is photography. And one of the reasons I really like photography is it's a fantastic hobby, especially now in the digital age where memory is very cheap. And darkroom techniques are fantastic and are still being maintained, thank goodness. But I got into photography as a digital photographer, so I don't have any darkroom skills. But one of the things that I'm very fortunate with my field work is that I get to travel to a lot of different places like the Galapagos Islands. And so I'm very lucky that I get to document my research and the things that I get to see. And I also really like photography because it sort of bridges my two backgrounds or my two careers, art basically, and science. And so you have the aesthetic and the artistic side of photography, but photography itself is very rooted in science. You know, lenses and aperture and focus and all that sort of stuff has a very physics-based is very physics-based, and so and it also lets me document my biology side. So I'm an avid photographer and very lucky to continue to be able to take photographs of my fieldwork. So today, regarding Darwin's finches and human influences, I want to focus on two primary questions, with the first being, does urbanization influence adaptation in Darwin's finches? Now, you might ask, well, why would urbanization have any influence on Darwin's finches? And that's a very good question. And so in collaboration with Maureen Alberti, Christian Correa, John Marsloff, Andrew Hendry, Eric Palkovics, Victoria Hunt, Travis Apgar, and Yu Zhu, we set out to look at this. And so what you're looking at here is a distribution of data points, basically. And each data point, what we did was we collected a whole bunch of studies where what they did, each study looked at a phenotype or a trait, and they looked at how the trait changed through time. So each data point represents a population where somebody measured changes in this phenotype in a phenotypic trait. So this database spans all taxa, including invertebrates, vertebrates, and plants. And so then what we did was each of the color codes is in relation to a different human influence. And one of those human influences was urbanization. And what we found was that urbanization appears to be accelerating rates of phenotypic change. So how much a trait will change through time, it appears to accelerate that change. So, and as I mentioned earlier, changes in a phenotype are often due to selection. So this means that urbanization itself is a selective pressure. And so on the Galapagos Islands, we have four islands that now have permanent human populations. And so this photo is from the largest town, Puerto Ayora on Santa Cruz. And you can see that there is urban infrastructure present on the Galapagos Islands. You've got paved roads, you have shopping, you have bars, you have hostels, you have grocery stores, you have everything that a permanent human population would need in a contemporary setting. So urbanization is present on the Galapagos Islands. Furthermore, we've seen an exponential increase in the number of visitors and the number of permanent residents. So on the right in orange, you have the number of tourists, and on the left in blue, you have the number of permanent human populations. And you can see since around the 1960s and 70s, there's been an exponential increase in the number of visitors and the number of permanent residents. Now, what I'm showing you are only data up to 2010. The last report that I heard from the governor of Galapagos from 2018 was that the number of visitors in 2018 was 280,000, and the permanent human population is 30,000. Now, of course, this year with the pandemic, this has completely changed, and what the impacts and influences will have are going to be very interesting. And my colleagues and I are trying to get the permits and the necessary permissions to go back and see how the organisms might be adapting to the lack of tourists. But for now, these results and the research that I'm going to present to you are the results of the impact of this sort of exponential increase in permanent residents and tourists. And so I'm going to focus on three questions regarding urbanization. And so the first one is, we expect that humans will have an influence on Darwin's finches because of urbanization, but do they actually? So first I want to take you to Santa Cruz, which is our primary field site. And we have two sites that we work at. So we have this site called El Garapatero, which is a remote site. There's no presence of humans here. And we also have Academy Bay, which is adjacent to Puerto Ayora, to the town. And so if we go to El Garapatero and we look at beak sizes, what do we find? And I just want to remind you that there's a tight link between the size and shape of the Darwin's finch beak and within a particular species and the types of foods they eat. And so what you're looking at here are four of the ground finches. And you can see with the small ground finch that they exploit small seed sizes, basically. Now, the large ground finch is unable to exploit these types of seeds because their beak is so large, they can't manipulate seeds that are this small. But conversely, the seeds and foods that the large ground finch eats, the small ground finch cannot exploit because they lack the size and the strength to be able to crack open and get at these types of seed items. And you can see the cactus finch has a very long, thin beak, and that's because it's adapted to feed on the nectar of the opuntia, or of the cactus flowers. Now, what's quite interesting is at El Garapatero, this divergence appears to be continuing, in that the medium ground finch, so you're looking at the small, medium, and large ground finch species here, the medium ground finch actually has two morphs, or what we call two morphs, or two sizes. So within the medium ground finch, there's a small beak-sized medium ground finch, and then there's also a large size medium ground finch. And if we look at a distribution of the beak sizes, you can see that there is this sort of what we call a bimodal. So there's two peaks basically. So you have your small morph, you have a large morph, and the intermediates are not present in the population. So there's some type of selection that's acting against those intermediates. Now, if we go to our site at Academy Bay, which is adjacent to Puerto Ayora, the largest town on Santa Cruz, historically, back in the 60s, we see this bimodal distribution. And the two colors represent the different sexes, but the important thing is that you can see there's a small morph and there's a large morph. Now, if we look at more contemporary data, in this particular case from 2004, that bimodality is no longer there. It's now more of a unimodal distribution. So there's been a shift at Academy Bay in the distribution of beak sizes since the 1960s. And we think that it's because it's right next to town. And as I mentioned before, there's been that exponential increase in the number of permanent human residents and the number of visitors. And so we think that it's correlated somehow to this exponential increase. So do humans have an influence on Darwin's finches? Yes, it appears to be the case, where they've changed the distribution of beak sizes at Academy Bay, which is right next to town. So the next question that I wanted to ask are humans changing the niche characteristics of Darwin's finches? And so this is done in collaboration with Diana Sharp, Jaime Chavez, Luis de Leon, Jeff Podos, Andrew Hendry, and Joost Raymakers. And so I want to remind you once more that there's that link between the size and shape of the beaks and the types of foods that they exploit. And what we think is going on is that there's been a change in the types of foods that they are eating, or niche characteristics. So niche characteristics are basically just a fancy way of saying what types of food are they eating. And so we can make some predictions regarding what we might expect to see at El Garapatero versus at Academy Bay regarding these types of niche characteristics. And so I'm going to be focusing on the difference between small and medium ground finches, with the assumption that the selection factors that are maintaining the difference between these two species are also the same ones that are maintaining the difference in the bimodal distribution within the medium ground finch. So we can make a prediction that El Garapatero, at a remote site where there's less human presence, we would expect what we would call a narrow niche breadth. So niche breadth is simply the variety of foods that you eat. So if you're given a huge types of all the types of foods that are available, we would expect that at El Garapatero, there would be narrow niche breadth, where the small ground finch and the medium ground finches feed the types of food that they are adapted to. Whereas at Academy Bay, which is right next to town, we would expect a wider niche breadth, where the finches are feeding on more varieties of types of foods. We can also make a prediction about overlap. So remembering back to how each of the species is adapted to feed on very specific types of seeds, which means that the types of foods that they eat are going to be different. There won't be any overlap in the types of food. Whereas at a site that has a more unimodal distribution, we would expect there to be high niche overlap. And so to do this, what we did was we set out and did walking transects basically, and we went and looked at what the finches were eating at these two different sites. So regarding niche breadth, on the y-axis, what you can see is, again, it's the types of foods that are available, what the finches will feed on. So if you're up the y-axis, it means of all the foods that are available, you're eating more variety of food, whereas if you're down the y-axis, you're eating less of the food types that are available. And then on the x-axis, what you have going from left to right is the different places where we looked at what the finches were feeding. So on the left, you have no human presence and no human foods. In the center, you have our Academy Bay, which is adjacent to town. And then on the right, you have town. And you have the two different colors representing the two different species. So red is small ground finch, blue is medium ground finch. And what you can see is that the niche breadth increases in town. So finches in town eat more of the types of food. They have a larger diet diversity than do the finches at where there's no human presence and no presence, or there's no presence of humans. So regarding our predictions, we do observe that there's a more narrow or lower niche breadth at El Carapetero, our remote site, as compared to our site that's right next to town and in town as well. Now regarding overlap, this is again whether or not the finches are feeding on the same types of food or if they're not feeding on the same types of food. So as you go up the y-axis, there's more overlap, so they are eating more of the same types of food as opposed to down the y-axis. And you have your x-axis, no human to adjacent and town gradient. And what we found was that there was an increase in overlap in town. So the finches in town are eating more of the same types of foods than they are at the site where there's no human presence. So regarding our predictions regarding niche breadth and niche overlap, they appear to be true. So are humans changing the niche characteristics of Darwin's finches? Yes, it does appear to be happening. And so the final question then is, do Darwin's finches prefer human foods? And just a reminder, we've seen the exponential increase of the number of permanent residents and the number of visitors to the Galapagos Islands. Now, what's important to think about, especially when we're just talking about niche characteristics, is that we humans can't feed on the foods that the Darwin's finches are eating. And so what we've done is we've brought our own foods with us. And this is important because it doesn't matter what size or shape beak you have to be able to exploit human foods such as popcorn or leftover rice, or in this particular case, a very cheeky finch was feeding literally right out of the breakfast bowl. And so we know that the Darwin's finches are feeding on these human foods, but the question then becomes, do they actually prefer these human foods? Like if you give the finches a choice, are they preferentially feeding on the human foods as opposed to the foods that they are adapted to eat? So to do this, we did a cafeteria style experiment where we presented to the finches both human foods and the types of foods that they are expected to exploit. And this is a video of one of our trials in town. And so we can see the finches are coming to the trays and they're feeding. So the question is, what are they feeding on? And quite interestingly, the finches could actually get quite aggressive over these food trays. So we did this experiment at 3 different sites. We did this at a remote site where there's no human presence. We did this on a beach, which is remote, so there's no urbanization, but locals and tourists quite often go to this beach and they bring picnics with them. So there's a very big presence of human foods on the beach. And then we also conducted this experiment in town. And so for each of these sites, what you're going to see is a plot. On the y-axis is the amount of food consumed. And on the left, you have your human foods. So you have crisp biscuits and rice. And so I made the slide when I was in England. So I'll do a quick translation for you. Crisps are potato chips and biscuits are cookies, and rice is rice. Rice is the same in the UK as it is here in Canada. And then on the right, you have your foods that the finches are supposed to be eating. So there's a plot for each of these sites. And at the site with no humans present, you can see the finches tended to not come to the trays very much, and when they did come to the trays, they didn't really express a preference either way. However, on the beach and in town, what you can see is that the human foods were preferentially consumed compared to the foods that they are supposed to be eating. So when there's a presence of human food, Darwin's finches preferentially feed on these human foods. So the natural question then becomes, oh, okay, so Darwin's finches, when there's the presence of human foods, are feeding on them. What might be a consequence of this? And so that's a very good question. And so in collaboration with Sarah Canuti and Jaime Chavez, what we did was we looked at the Darwin's finch gut microbiome. And what I'm showing you here on the y-axis is the Shannon index, which is basically a biodiversity index. So we're looking at the gut microbiome bacterial diversity. And we basically sampled poop from medium and small ground finches at 3 different sites. So the first site is there's no presence of humans and there's no presence of human foods. There's a site where there's human foot traffic, but there's no human foods. And then there's a site where there's both the presence of humans and the presence of human foods. And what we had predicted is at the sites with no human food, we would expect a difference in the gut microbiome bacterial biodiversity between the 2 species because they have the lower niche breadth and lower niche overlap. So they're feeding on different types of foods. Whereas at the site with the presence of human foods, because they're consuming the same types of food, we had expected to find less of a difference in bacterial diversity. And so at the site with no human foods, we found that there is a difference. It was only significantly different at one site, but there is a difference between the 2 species in terms of gut microbiome bacterial diversity. However, at the site with human foods, we also found that there is a difference between the 2 species. Furthermore, when you look at the 2 different species and how they differ, at a site with no human foods and at a site with human foods, there was a difference within species in their gut microbiome. So clearly human foods are having an effect on gut microbiome. And what we're working on now is what these differences in the microbiome might have, for example, in relation to immune function. So we're working on, we're researching that right now. So do Darwin's finches prefer human foods? Yes, they do. And so in general, does urbanization influence adaptation in Darwin's finches? Yes, it does. And so before we get to my last question, I want to just take you through my last part of my personal adaptation. And I just want you to think, so if, in case you weren't aware, as part of the celebration of women in science, Vanier is screening a fantastic documentary called Picture a Scientist. You can view the link on their website and get the information, and I highly recommend it. I've only seen the preview simply because I was preparing for today, but as soon as this and the panel are done, I intend to watch the documentary. And so just in terms of picturing a scientist, my adventures in science from my PhD through to my postdoc, I've had the great fortune of doing both field and lab experimental work. So these 2 photos on the left are from a large-scale lab experiment that I did at McDonald campus out on the West Island in St. Anne de Bellevue. These are photos from the Galapagos. This is from the Bahamas. And then this is my PhD defense. And my main point of this slide is that I've been very fortunate as a scientist to have the opportunities to do experiments and do field work. But what you might think of as a scientist, perhaps a elder white male in a lab coat in a very sterile sort of laboratory setting, is not the only picture of a scientist. And that science you can go out and get dirty in the mud, or you can do your own experiments. So there's a lot of different opportunities and a lot of different ways that scientists work. So again, I just wanted to mention that if you can, I suggest going to watch Picture a Scientist. All right, so finally, can Darwin's finches adapt to the presence of invasive species? And the reason I'm asking this is because on the Galapagos Islands, we now know that there are introduced mammalian predators, namely house cats and black rats, as well as other rats like Norwegian rats and house mice as well. But in terms of predation, the reason this is important is because, as Darwin himself noted in The Voyage of the Beagle, all of the terrestrial birds are often approached sufficiently near to be killed with a switch, and sometimes, as I myself tried, with a cap or a hat. So needless to say, we are not allowed to do that with the Darwin's finches these days, but back in Charles Darwin's day, that was what they did engage in as a naturalist. But the point is that the land birds, including Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands, have a evolutionary naivete to mammalian predators. So I'm just going to take you quickly through 4 different questions relating to invasive predators. And so the first question, though, is it's a bit like the urbanization. Well, does the presence of invasive predators increase anti-predator behavior? So to do this, I did an among island comparison. So I have 4 islands that have the presence of house cats and rats. And then I have 2 islands where they are pristine. There's no history whatsoever of invasive mammalian predators. And what I did was I quantified an anti-predator behavior called flight initiation distance, or abbreviated as FID. So flight initiation distance is the distance at which a prey will flee an approaching predator. So on the y-axis, as you go up the y-axis, you have increased anti-predator behavior, which means that you are going to run away at a larger distance from an approaching predator. Whereas if you go down the y-axis, you have decreased anti-predator behavior. So that means that you will allow a predator to get closer to you before you make the decision to flee. On the left, you have your 2 pristine islands, and on the right, you have your 4 islands that have the presence of house cats and rats. And what I found is that predators do increase anti-predator behavior in Darwin's finches. So on the islands that have the presence of house cats and rats, you have increased anti-predator behavior as compared to islands that do not have the presence of invasive mammalian predators. So does the presence of invasive predators increase anti-predator behavior? Yes, it does. So what happens though when you remove the predator? So a very common conservation outcome, a very common conservation measure is to eradicate invasive predators on islands. And so what happens to that anti-predator behavior once you remove those predators? And so on 2 islands, at the time of my data collection, the park had successfully eliminated or eradicated house cats and rats from 2 of the islands. And so this is a really interesting question, because what it allows me to ask is that increase in anti-predator behavior actually evolved? Is there a genetic basis for it, or is it purely plastic? And so what I would predict is that if it was actually evolved, is that once you remove the predators, that increased anti-predator behavior will be maintained. Or if it was purely plastic and there's a cost to this increased anti-predator behavior, I would expect a reversion of the anti-predator behavior to baseline levels. And so here what you can see is you have your pristine islands, you have your islands with the presence of house cats and rats. And when you look at the data, you can see that increased anti-predator behavior has been maintained even though the islands have successfully been rid of cats and rats. Now, these islands were eradicated in 2003 and 2008, and my data collection were in 2016 to 2018. And so enough generations has passed that I would expect that if this was a purely plastic response, there would have been a reversion in anti-predator behavior by now. The one thing I can't rule out is cultural transmission or learned behavior, and that this increased anti-predator behavior is being passed through learned behavior or cultural transmission. And parsing out whether or not this is evolved or a cultural transmission is an area of future research that I'm interested in. So very tantalizingly, it suggests that this increased anti-predator behavior has a genetic basis. Now, another question I wanted to ask is, does urbanization affect behavior? And so just a reminder again of that exponential increase in the number of visitors and permanent human residents on the Galapagos Islands. And what's interesting about urbanization is that we can make 2 different predictions. One is that in urban areas, because you have more resources for with things like water, for example, you might expect there to be a higher density of predators, which might increase anti-predator behavior in the finches. Conversely, in urban areas, as you saw, there's large numbers of stimuli. So you've got taxis and trucks and cars and restaurants and noise and all sorts of things. And so these large number of stimuli might habituate the finches, and so you would have decreased anti-predator behavior in urban areas. And so what I'm showing you here are the data that I've already presented to you. So you have your pristine islands, and you have your 4 islands that show increased anti-predator behavior with the presence of invasive predators. These 4 islands also are the 4 islands that have towns or urbanization on them. And so what I'll show you is the comparison of urban finches to non-urban finches. So the data that I'm showing here are anti-predator behaviors from finches in non-urban areas. And then you have your eradicated islands on the right. And so what you can see is that in general, the finches in town have lower anti-predator behavior than do the finches in non-urban areas. And there's a couple of different interesting things in this particular plot. The first is that the size or amount of urbanization appears to have an effect. So this difference is non-significant in Floriana. Floriana is the island that has the smallest town. It has a permanent population of about 125 humans right now. This difference between urban and non-urban finches becomes significant on Isabella. So it's which is the island with the next largest town, but that town is only about has a permanent population of about 1,200. So what it's suggesting is that there's an urbanization threshold in terms of finches adapting to urbanization, but it's a very low threshold because the difference between Floriana and Isabella is only about 1,000 people. And then the other thing that's quite interesting is that especially in some of these larger towns, what you can see is that urbanization has reduced anti-predator behavior to levels lower than what you find on pristine islands. And so what this is suggesting is that urbanization can strongly counteract any adaptations to the presence of invasive predators, to the point where anti-predator behavior goes lower than what you find on pristine islands. And so this suggests that that urbanization is a stronger selection pressure than invasive predators. So does urbanization affect behavior? Yes, it does. And so my last question is it replicable? And this is because I have a confession to make. These data that I've shown you thus far, it was done with a human stimulus. So myself or my field assistants were the ones that were the simulated predator and quantified the anti-predator behavior in the finches. And so I've been going on and on about invasive predators, and you may very rightly ask me, well, Kiyoko, you don't really look like a cat, nor are you the same size. And to that I say, fair enough. And so what I did was I did try and get a real cat. I couldn't, so I did the next best thing, which was to get a fake cat. So I'd like you to meet Bartolome, one of my stuffed cats. And as you can see, Bartolome on his own cannot move. And so to quantify anti-predator behavior, what I did was I strapped him to a remote control vehicle. And so he got his own taxi seat. And this was the whole family of stuffed cats that I used. And for a perspective of what this looked like, there is a finch about here. It just flew away. And then you can see you put a marker where the finch was, you put a marker where the stimulus is, and then you measure the distance. And so that's how flight initiation distance or anti-predator behavior is quantified with a cat on a remote control vehicle. And in case you're wondering what it looks like from the finch's perspective, okay, so for logistical purposes, I was only able to do this on the islands that had the urban, non-urban comparison in anti-predator behavior. And so on the left is a human stimulus, on the right are the cat stimuli. And what you can see is that that difference between urban and non-urban finches is also present using house cats and, using a stuffed cat on a remote control vehicle. So is it replicable with a more appropriate type of stimuli? Yes, it is. So can Darwin's finches adapt to the presence of invasive species? Yes, they are adapting. And so today, what I've shown you is that there's been an increase in urbanization and tourists and permanent human residents in the Darwin's finches, that this has affected the Darwin's finches in terms of their beak size and beak shape. This is due to shifts in their niche characteristics, and that Darwin's finches are preferentially feeding on human foods when given the opportunity. And I've also shown you that Darwin's finches have adapted to the presence of invasive species, even when the species are removed, and that urbanization can strongly counteract this adaptation. And so the implications are that there are consequences of human interactions with nature, and that humans are affecting evolution and adaptation by influencing selection. And so I just want to wrap up very quickly and just say, if you're interested in science, if you're interested in looking at human influences, doing field work or any of those sorts of things, I'm starting as an assistant professor of August 1st next year at Brock University. Brock is in the Niagara region in Ontario. And if you're interested, you can find out more about my research program at my website, www.kiyokogotanda.com. And I would be happy, please get in touch if you're interested in potentially doing an undergraduate degree in Ontario, or eventually if you would like to do graduate work, please get in touch. And also if you're interested in doing fieldwork, although fieldwork probably won't be happening because of the pandemic for at least one more year, unfortunately. So in conclusion, the science take home is that humans are affecting evolution and ecology. And I hope just by sharing a little bit of my background, I just want to say you can have a very different background from what you're interested in doing. If you told me when I was a dancer that I was going to end up being a professor, I would have said, oh, very funny. But here I am today. And that life can change and take you in unexpected directions. And that I'm only here because I was open to new experiences and to learning as well. And so with that, I'd like to thank my funding sources, everybody who's helped me, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
So thank you very much, and congratulations to you for your appointment. That's great to hear. So we have a question from a student that asks, do you think that urbanization has a big impact on other animals in the Galapagos other than finches?
That's a great question, and definitely yes. It's definitely yes, but it's also that's a really good question, because the Galapagos are known for their animals being so naive. So the classic sort of videos you see in documentaries are people stepping over marine iguanas, or stepping over the sea lions that come up. You know, the sea lions will actually literally kick you off a park bench. Like, so up by the dock, there are these benches. And if you're sitting there, we've seen it where a sea lion will come and want to lay on the bench, and it just plows into you. So there's definitely, it's definitely the urbanization will definitely have an effect on other organisms in the Galapagos, but it's going to be a bit unique because the Galapagos are unique. So how urbanization is affecting other animals is is an area that I'm interested in. We do know, for example, so in terms of anti-predator behavior, just anecdotally, we know that things like the little Sally Lightfoot crabs, they do have different anti-predator behavior than when you go to one of the other islands or something like that. So there is a difference. Urbanization is affecting the other animals. Exactly how and what the consequences of it are, we're not entirely sure, but we're working on that. We're looking at urban, non-urban differences, and plant-finch interactions. Those are the finches, but there's definitely areas of research that can be looking at other organisms and how it's affecting it, especially in relation to things like food items and stuff like that.
Okay. We have a question from another student. When we talk about sexual selection in these species, is beak size an important factor when choosing a mate? For example, the bigger the beak, the higher chance of mating success?
So that's a great question. And there is sexual selection in the Darwin's finches, but it's not quite in the way that you think, that you would sort of traditionally think of it. So that bimodal distribution of the medium ground finch in El Garapatero, we know that that's maintained by what we call assortative mating. So the small morph medium ground finches mate with the small morph, and the large morph Darwin's finches mate with the large morph medium ground finches mate with a large morph. And that's sort of one of the reasons why that bimodality is maintained. And for the finches, they use a variety of cues for their sexual selection, one of which is song. That's really important, and the different morphs and the different species have different song. So there is sexual selection in that, like species and like morphs mate with each other. There is hybridization that occurs, as the Darwins Finches have famously, as Peter and Rosemary Grant have famously documented. But it's not just the larger you are, the sexier you are. It's not. It's not quite. It's not like with deer or other mammals, for example, where size is a major factor in sexual selection. It's things more like song and mating with the one that looks like you, with the Darwins Finches.
Okay, we have a couple of three questions coming up right here. How did you realize that you had an interest in biology to the point of working in this field? You went from dancing to science, which are two completely different things.
That's a great question. So my mom was instrumental in maintaining sort of a nature sciencey type background. So when I grew up in the States, actually, in San Diego. And so my mom always made sure that we regularly went to the Natural History Museum. We had yearly passes to the San Diego Zoo. There's a science center that we would always go to. So my mom maintained a sort of sciencey type interest in me. And then during my dancing years, I always loved watching nature documentaries, David Attenborough and that sort of stuff. And actually, when I started my undergraduate degree, so I was a mature student. I did my undergraduate after my dancing career. And so when I went to undergraduate degree, I actually wanted to go into environmental science. I wanted to do sort of more environment, save the world type things. And it was through, and my counselor at McGill, because I was like, oh, I don't know, I want to go into environment, but I also want to do marine biology. I just got my scuba certification. So I really wanted to go diving all the time. I was like, oh man, I don't know, maybe marine biology. So he suggested I do an environment course and I do a biology course. And the biology course was Intro to Ecology and Evolution. And I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. But then when I started to do as well was I also volunteered in labs. And that was instrumental because it was so cool. I had to measure fish eggs, basically, was the first thing that I did when I volunteered in a lab. But then the grad student that I was working with showed me the data and how it supported these questions that she was asking. And I was like, oh, wait, that's so cool. You can ask a question, then figure out a way to try and answer it. Like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. So that sort of put me on the trajectory of science, and especially ecology and evolution.
We have a question from the audience. So Kira, Kira, are you ready to ask your question? Oh, Kira, I don't know what happened to Kira. Okay, that's fine. I think she lowered her hand now. Let's look at the next question. Which other species do you think are being affected by urbanization? I think you answered that one.
Yeah, just to add on very quickly, though, what's really interesting, and one of the things that we urban ecology evolution people are looking at, though, is not all species, especially on the mainland, like in Europe and in North America, for example, not all species like urbanization. Some species adapt better to urban areas than others. And so one of the things we're interested in is, well, what is it about urban species, or species that adapt well to urbanization? What's different about them than the ones that don't like it? And there's a variety of, there's a whole variety of reasons. And what's also really interesting is some species are actually diverging. So there's a species of bird in California where you've got a rural population and you have an urban population, and they are genetically distinct and they have very different adaptations. So urbanization also actually appears to be a source of divergence.
We have a question from, I think it's Heather. Oh, okay, there. Is that Heather Rafi? Heather has her hand up. Heather Rafi, is that you?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, Kiyoko, I really am interested in hearing more about your journey and your interests when you were just starting out in science. And maybe you could share that with us. And because I think there's a lot of students who are not quite sure what direction and how to find a direction. So if you could share a little bit more, I think that would be great.
Thanks, Heather, for that question. And thank you also, Heather, for suggesting me to join this fantastic event at Vanier. Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's, for me, going into undergraduate was a little bit different because I had already had one career, basically. And so I was going to undergraduate without not, like I said, I wanted to go into environment, like I wanted to, be a David Suzuki and go out and save the world. But beyond that, I really wasn't sure. And actually undergrad too, because I was going back to school because I wanted to, it was actually really hard because I was like, oh, look at all these art classes or liberal arts classes that I mean, you can take classes on Japanese film or, language courses or the history of, something. And I sort of almost wished I could have had more electives so I could have explored further these different areas. But it's sort of a little bit of a what interests you. So even so I sort of, like I said, I kind of was like, oh, marine biology versus environment, but I mean, it was all really up in the air. It wasn't until I volunteered in labs and I took courses. It wasn't until I actually especially when I took evolution in my second year, those kinds of courses really, when you get to learn things that interest you. So, okay, this is not a very good answer to your question. Sorry. I think it was definitely a matter of, oh my gosh, this is so cool. This class is so cool. I want to learn more. I want to and the opportunities. So when you're thinking about where you want to go next after CJEP, I think there's a question of what kind of opportunities do you want to have to pursue, and you might not know which way you're going to go, but if you've got the opportunities in front of you, that I think is fairly important. And I was lucky enough that when I started my undergraduate, I had fantastic opportunities in terms of courses to take, and fantastic professors, and opportunities for fieldwork and lab research volunteering and that sort of stuff. Those were there at, so I did my undergraduate at McGill. Those were there for me, and that was very instrumental in shaping my trajectory. And then it just sort of snowballed. For me, it just sort of snowballed. This whole research, asking questions and answering them just still is what motivates me today, because with all this research that I just presented, I'm sure there's lots more questions. They just also generate, you answer one question, but then you generate more questions. And so it's, so I'd say just follow what interests you. And as you go down, as you pursue those interests, ask people and try and create opportunities to pursue whichever way that path might go. And it might wildly diverge. Like I said, if you told me when I was dancing, when I was back doing Casse-Noisette and the Nutcracker, oh, you're going to go to the Galapagos Islands and study urbanization effects on Darwin's finches, I would have actually been like, I don't even know where the Galapagos is. So.
Speaking of unanswered questions, that's my lead-in. There's so many questions for you. You have opened up our minds. There may be, let me see if I can, I think you answered this question. Do you think that urbanization could offer a more stable environment for some species and create a new ecosystem? Exploitation of natural habitats cause immense trauma to some species while urban areas stay relatively stable.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And what I can add about my discussion on urbanization, some people one argument that can be made is that urbanization in some ways is a more stable area because of more abundant resources. So if you can adapt to human foods and the artificial water resources and the green spaces and parks and stuff like that, then in some ways that does create a more stable environment. That being said, it's also a very different environment from nature. Same thing. So you've got green spaces, but you also have a lot of concrete, right? And buildings and high rises. And so, for example, for birds who nest in trees, with the lack of trees in cities, do they adapt or not to being able to nest on buildings or ledges or that sorts of thing? So it's a good question, and it's one of these sort of developing areas as we go down, as we continue on understanding urban ecology and evolution. And so I think that's more like a stay tuned type question as we figure out more what's going on with urbanization.
Okay, next one would be, want to get to a question here. Is the human food, so there's a few questions about food, so I'll maybe look at them all together. Is the human food consumed by the finches of higher calorie content than local foods? And if so, do we see an increase in reproduction rates? And then I want to just look at, do you know if feeding on human foods affect the overall health of the finches? Have we seen any change in their lifespan?
So those are both very good questions. And unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for either of them. I should go back. We have looked at nutritional content, but we haven't compared it directly to the human foods. So there is some thought that with high fat content and that sort of stuff might be beneficial to the finches. So we're actually working on, with my colleague Sarah Canuti, she's actually looking at things like, do urban finches do better than non-urban finches due to resources? And so she's looking at it in terms of immune parasite resistance. And her preliminary results suggest that urban finches do better than non-urban finches. And she thinks it's due to the increase of human foods or resources, basically. But she's not sure if that's causal or if that's just correlational at this time. So I don't know directly if human foods have more nutritional content than the foods that they're supposed to be eating. They will have things though, like more salt, fat, and sugar. But if it's significantly different, I don't know. And how that's affecting the Darwin's Finch fitness is another stay tuned question.
Let's see, we still have a few minutes. Did finches have predators before the arrival of humans, when the island was pristine? If so, did the arrival of humans have a positive or negative impact on the survival rates of the finches?
So there are endemic predators of Darwin's finches. There are owls and there are hawks. And there's also a little bit of evidence that snakes might depredate the nests, although the snakes is a little bit not quite as strong. But there are definitely hawks and owls, and they are present on the pristine islands. And so that's why I was able to make my conclusion that it was the invasive mammalian predators that was affecting the anti-predator behavior, because the Darwin's finches do have their predators basically on all these different islands. And so the main thing that was differing among the islands was the presence or absence of invasive mammalian predators. And what was the other part about the arrival of humans and how that affected Darwin's finches' survival? That's a good question, and I don't know. Sorry.
Let me see. Okay, then we have, Do you believe that there can be applied uses of your research to help mitigate the changes caused by urbanization?
Yes, I do. When it comes to applied research, I feel like my contribution is about that much, and simply because the effects of urbanization or any type of human influence are so massive. So you sort of just have to pick one little thing to look at, because so I'm focusing on mostly behavioral adaptations, but you've got physiology, you've got survival, you've got reproduction, you've got all these other different types of traits that you could be looking at, and the effects of urbanization. And I'm interested in all of those, and that's one of the things that I'm hoping to expand my research program. But as one person, as a lone, as a single scientist, we can only hope to make little tiny contributions that will eventually be able to shape sort of large scale policy. So I'd like to think that my research can be applied to conservation and mitigation policy and legislation, but right now it's just one little tiny sliver that will inform a larger thing. And the hard part too, when it comes to policy and legislation and applied sciences, it's beyond just the biological sciences. You've got other things that that people have to consider, like economics and political science and that sort of thing. So so like I said, mine's just like one little drop in the bucket, but hopefully that bucket will then become full enough to properly inform applied policy and those sorts of things.
Okay, that's great. We have two more questions, and then I'm going to read out all the love you got on the chat. Do you know if there are wildlife species that specifically adapted a certain phenotype for urban setting, especially in older cities that have been around for thousands of years?
That's a great question. So there is some evidence that species that are able to innovate better are more likely to adapt to urban areas better. But in terms of like sort of the long-term urbanization effects, that's a really good question. And I actually, I'll have to get back to you on that one. Because I always think of urbanization, most of my work is focused on urbanization in sort of contemporary context, which is one of the kind of cool things with the Galapagos, because urbanization has only been around for, 50, 70 years. But that's a great question when you think about cities, in Europe especially, that have been around for centuries, that how the animals there would adapt and what the characteristics of those would be. So that's one of those things that I'm interested in, is trying to understand immediate. So you've got your immediate adaptations, and then you have your sort of long-term evolved traits as well. And so that's a very good question.
It makes me think of course, David Attenborough's cities in his Planet Earth 2 series, where you have the sparrows that all congregate in the city just because of the concrete heat and the heat concentration, but yet that might be sort of a temporary, not a genetic thing. So I think that you were trying to determine if it's a genetic component that is actually can be passed on to the offspring.
Yeah, that's an area of future research. So we do misnet the birds and take a little blood sample. And so hopefully down the road, we'll be able to determine if there is a genetic basis for these adaptations, hopefully down the road. That's right. One of the long-term goals.
Okay, we have concerns about climate change, and do you practice dance still? And if not, do you miss it? So I wanted to rush through those because of course it's important to understand what do you do with your artistic practice now that you're not a teenager anymore and not dancing anymore. And also because that obviously fed you artistically. And the finches are important to consider also, like on top of all this is climate change having an effect.
So regarding climate change, yes, it's having an effect. It's the impacts of the El Nino and La Nina years, the impacts on especially the marine environment. Every year we go down, and when we talk to our colleagues, there's one year where the marine environment was, you know, a couple of degrees warmer than what it was supposed to be due to an El Nino. But then bizarrely, I can't remember. El Ninos are supposed to also affect the terrestrial land, but then it was like a drought practically with increased rains, if I'm correct. Anyways, we were there during one of these El Nino years, and we were expecting all this stuff to happen on the terrestrial side, but all the effects were on the marine side. And so that in itself was weird. So climate change is definitely having an effect on the Galapagos. It used to be reliable that the breeding season was between January and April of every year. And so if you wanted to do anything related to reproduction or breeding, you would go down starting in January, do your field work, and it'd be fine. And just since I've been going since 2013, you can't rely on that anymore. The breeding season and the breeding season is reliant on climate. You need it to be a rainy season so that all the plants come out, which means all the insects come out, because that's what the Darwins Finches feed their young, are insects, caterpillars, and that sort of stuff. So without the rains, you don't have any reproduction. So and so that's changed, where we'd go down in January and it would be completely dry, and then we'd go down in March and it would be completely dry, and then a colleague of mine needed a breeding season and she ended up staying until August. So climate change is definitely having an effect on the Galapagos Islands. Regarding the dance, I don't dance anymore. It's a little too painful. I have gone and taken ballet classes or done like just a little bit of a bar, and yeah, it's pretty painful. Maybe one day if I could do it regularly, I might get back into it. No, so I do mostly things like yoga and that sort of stuff. I actually have a friend in my building who has a dog, and so I take the dog out for walks regularly just to get out from behind the computer.
Okay. Time for some love to you. Here are some of the comments. I love the idea of the stuffed cat on the RC car. It's crazy how we have to consider several things as humans do to impact and affect these birds, like installing in their habitat, or even as far as the foods we leave out for them to feed on. Another one, I will definitely be thinking about fitness, function, and phenotypes. I knew that the same species of animals can have different phenotypes, but I didn't know about fitness function. I'm grateful to know that fitness function can shift depending on environmental factors, which affect phenotypes, which ones will be more prevalent. Here's one. I'm thankful for Kiyoko's enthusiasm and passion for science. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. From Tom, I will be thinking about the importance of influence of humans on animal species. I certainly do some research on Galapagos Islands. I think he's saying he wants to. That video of the snakes chasing their prey was very cool. Another one from Brenda. I'd like to thank you for explaining how humans disturb the environment for animals and how we affect overall evolution. It really brings into perspective what our actions do to our environment. Thank you, Dr. Gotanda, for this presentation. I knew that human influence had bad effects on organisms living there. However, I did not know to what extent it was invasive. Just living in their environment seems to influence greatly the natural selection. It makes you wonder how much humans influences the other organisms on a global scale. We have so many questions, so many like messages of love for you here. Very organized and well thought. Thank you, Dr. Gotanda, for educational Zoom webinar. It was extremely interesting. As a young woman who would like to pursue a career in science, This Zoom presentation taught me many things. I will keep thinking about Darwin, almost he almost missed this discovery because he thought finches were dull. It's for sure an eye-opener. I would like to add that your photography is extremely beautiful. I've always believed that science and art go seamlessly together. So I'm gonna send those to you in a separate email because to gather them all now. But I think we can all put on our cameras and say thank you. And we'll see you very soon in the panel discussion. So join the panel discussion. Thank you for attending Women of Science talk today.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's been an absolute honor and a pleasure to be here. And thank you to all for the fantastic questions. And feel free to send me more questions if you have any. Let me know.
Bye.